people say that city officials orchestrated a cover-up. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't a chapter in a book. It happened to real people.
They burned the whole town down, but it will rise again.
Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Robin Givhan, Senior Critic-at-Large at the Washington Post. And it is my pleasure that today joining me are two women behind the powerful documentary about the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and the racial violence that preceded it. We are joined by producer and director Dawn Porter, as well as our own DeNeen L. Brown, who serves as contributing reporter for the documentary. Thank you both for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us, and so good to be with you both.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to really just start from the beginning, which is sort of the thought process, Dawn, about wanting to make this documentary. I mean, this is the 100th anniversary, but I'm wondering what compelled you to really want to tell this particular story?
You know, I was familiar with the Tulsa Massacre. I had done 4 short films for the Smithsonian African American Museum of History and Culture. And one of those short films was retelling the Tulsa story with some original footage. But I wasn't aware of the facts of the Red Summer. And so National Geographic called me and asked if I would be interested in doing something about Tulsa and the Red Summer, and they mentioned that they were already collaborating with DeNeen. And to tell you the truth, that was a very big draw for me because I come from a journalism background. I believe it's so important to have accurate facts, and her involvement made me feel like I would have an expert in-house and that we could really dive into the story. It became clear as soon as DeNeen and I started speaking that at first she was going to be a consultant and she was going to be our expert resident brain, but it became so clear that with her personal connections to Oklahoma and her passion for this reporting, I asked her if she would be on camera and she accepted. And so I think that just adds a beautiful, poignant layer to this story to have it told in part through her eyes.
Yeah, I mean, that leads me perfectly to my question for you, DeNeen, which is, I mean, you have that personal connection to Oklahoma. You are an Oklahoman, and you have family there. One, I'm curious how much you knew about the Tulsa story before you started reporting it for the Post. If you were intimately familiar with the details of it, or if it was just sort of a hum below the surface, and what drew you into the project?
So yes, I love to tell the story. My people are from Oklahoma. My father's people are from Oklahoma. My great grandmother lived in Tulsa. My grandmother was born in an all-Black town 60 miles from Tulsa. It's called Boley. It's famous for its Black rodeo. My dad lives in Tulsa now, and he built his church in North Tulsa, which incorporates Greenwood. I'm from Oklahoma. I grew up playing in the red dirt there and riding horses. And this all started when I drove basically from Kansas across the Cimarron Turnpike, the Tornado Alley, to go visit my father and my stepmother. And we were having lunch on Black Wall Street. And I looked around and I noticed that it had become gentrified. And I knew that this was sacred ground. I knew that this was the site of a massacre, one of the worst incidents of racial terror in U.S. history committed against Black people. Now, in terms of my family story, my aunt told me that when my grandmother, whom we call Mama Helen, was growing up in Oklahoma, she used to hear adults whisper in the kitchen about, they called it the riot. At the time, they called it the riot. And as you know, Robin, in Black culture, children are seen and not heard, right? So you kind of stay away from adult conversation. But it was something that was whispered about in my family. I don't remember exactly when it crystallized for me what happened. But I know that as a child, I've always been interested in the story of my people, the story of Black people, the story of Black history. And I knew, even as a child, sitting in those classes, those integrated classes, that there was something missing from my textbook. And I wanted to find out what was missing from the textbook and what happened to my people. So yeah, this story about the Tulsa, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that one of the things that seemed to sort of bring you into the story in contemporary times was the fact that finally the gravesite, or the suspected gravesite, was going to be explored.
Yeah, so what happened, I also love telling the story. After that visit with my dad, I flew back to Washington and I told my editor, Linda Robinson, whom you know is this amazing editor at the Post, what I saw in terms of gentrification on Black Wall Street. And she said, that's a great story. And the Washington Post sent me back to Tulsa to do the reporting on the ground. That story landed on the front page of the Washington Post in September 2018. And then 2 days later, the mayor of Tulsa is at a community meeting where the Reverend Turner stood up. He held my story and he said, you're developing North Tulsa, but you wouldn't have this land had there not been a massacre. What are you going to do about it? And that's when the mayor announced that he was going to reopen the search for mass graves. So that's happening now. As you know, in October 2020, Tulsa discovered a mass grave in Oaklawn Cemetery. You can see it in the picture. And as we speak now, they are exhuming remains from that mass grave. They found as many as 28 coffins in that mass grave. This was unmarked land. There were no headstones in this part where this mass grave was discovered. And so scientists are continuing to examine the bones. They're looking for trauma, any signs of bullet fragments, or charring or burning that would connect the remains that they found in this mass grave to the massacre, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre.
You know, what is so powerful about the documentary is that it tells the story of, Tulsa, but it also puts it into extraordinary context, meaning that the story of the Red Summer. And I'm just wondering, DeNeen, if you can talk a little bit about what that really meant, the Red Summer, where that name comes from, and the violence that led up to the particular violence in Greenwood.
Yes, so Red Summer was a term that was coined by James Weldon Johnson. Many of our listeners may know that James Weldon Johnson was a composer with his brother of the National Negro Anthem. He called this reign of terror that consumed as many as 25 cities across the country when white mobs descended on Black communities and massacred Black people. He called this reign of terror Red Summer to describe all the blood that flowed in the streets of these cities and communities. Again, during Red Summer, you had massacres in Washington, D.C. You had massacres in Omaha, Nebraska. Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas was one of the worst massacres in U.S. history. A lot of people don't know about it, but Don features it in this film where we travel to Elaine, Arkansas, and we talk to descendants of massacre victims. I stand on the soil of cotton plantations and cotton farms. and we explored what happened during the massacre that occurred in Elaine in 1919. This all set the stage for Tulsa. This reign of terror where Black people were killed by white mobs set the stage for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and also beyond to Rosewood. And so that's what I was hoping in my reporting to capture, that this reign of terror is all connected.
And before we continue with that, I wanted to circle back to you, Dawn, to talk a bit about what has been described as economic jealousy and some of the motivations behind the violence. Can you speak to that and the fact that so many of these communities were not just Black communities, but they were successful Black communities?
Sure. You know, one of the benefits of working with a journalist is the reporting helps you see patterns, and it helps you go beyond. I think there, to the extent that people knew about Tulsa at all, there was this misimpression that it was an anomaly, that it was a one-off event. And actually what we see is an all too familiar and disturbing pattern where the communities that are targeted are successful communities. That doesn't mean that all of the residents were wealthy, but it means that they were thriving economically, socially. People were just living their lives. They were bakers, they were hairdressers, they were porters. Some of them were very wealthy. Some of them were owners of property. But even more than the ones who were on the really extreme end of wealth, to me, what was so striking was you just literally saw Black people living their lives. You saw them with good churches and schools and a self-sufficient community. And that fact was almost enough to be a threat to this idea of white supremacy. And so there is a consistent pattern of Blacks trying to unionize. That's the Elaine, Arkansas story. Or Blacks just doing well. That's the Tulsa story. And it's coupled with, a trumped up allegation of some Black man being an aggressor against a white woman, and that is enough to set a match to a powder keg, and which in all of these cases led to the wholesale killing of Black people in public and with the sanction of the government. And so, one of the things that was so important to me in understanding these facts is if you understand the motivation for the attacks, you kind of rewrite this story in a way that's factually accurate. There was envy at the success of Black people. That is not how we are taught our history. We are taught that we are constantly struggling and resilient but downtrodden. What was actually happening was in that early part of the 20th century, Blacks were doing well, and they were doing remarkably well considering they were just a few decades out of slavery, out of being enslaved. And so, people always say to me, was this so difficult to do? Was this, such a hard film to make? And of course, watching images of killing is brutal and terrible. But as DeNeen mentioned, there were whispers about these atrocities I didn't grow up in Tulsa, but I heard whispers about, kind of threats to Black people. So I wasn't as shocked by the violence as some others have been. But what I was shocked by was the understanding that we were strong and doing well, and that it was actually envy and not just some random hatred of dark skin that was kind of instigating this amount of terrible violence in this whole period.
Well, I know one of the most disturbing stories certainly is about Will Brown in Omaha, who was a Black man who was killed there. DeNeen, if you could speak to that. And, I'm also very struck by some of the factors in the backlash as described as the economic insecurity of white citizens, white supremacists, the perceived, the fact that Black people were simply living their lives, and that was an affront to their white neighbors. That really resonates still in 2021. How do you sort of connect all of those dots, and then tell the story of Will Brown?
So, as Don said, there was tremendous economic envy of Black people who had prospered just years out of enslavement. I mean, some of the people were formerly enslaved Black people, and they built these towns because of segregation. They were self-contained Black worlds of prosperity. They had schools in Tulsa. They had as many as 10,000 Black people living in Greenwood. They had 30 restaurants. They had luxury shops. They had Black millionaires who owned oil wells. There was a Black man who owned 6 private airplanes. There were Black business owners who owned luxury hotels that would rival any luxury hotel across the country. So again, these in Tulsa, which was called by Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington visited Tulsa in the early 1900s, and he called this Greenwood Negro Wall Street. We now call it Black Wall Street, but he said because of all the bustling prosperity, it looked like Wall Street. So again, it was destroyed in the Tulsa Race Massacre that began on May 31st, 1921 and ended on June 1st, 1921. In Omaha, Nebraska, what you have there is Will Brown was a Black man. He was about 40. You showed the picture of him. He had severe arthritis. He was accused of assaulting a white woman as she walked with her partner, as she walked with her boyfriend down the streets of Omaha. And witnesses, those who knew him said he could barely walk himself, but he was accused of this assault. And as Don was saying, some of these massacres were sparked by the false accusations that a Black man had attacked a white woman. It was all it took was the spark of an assault for a white mob to descend on these communities and destroy the economic prosperity. So in the case of Will Brown in Omaha, he's taken to a courthouse. And this was a brand new courthouse in downtown Omaha, brand new building in 1919. And the white mob descended on the courthouse, demanded that the sheriff release Will Brown. And then you can see in the picture there, they began scaling the walls in this bloodlust, demanding that the sheriff release Will Brown. And finally, he's pulled out of a window. They string him up to a light post at the south part of this courthouse. They shoot him more than 100 times. They dismember him. They cut off fingers and toes. They burn his body. So it was a horrible, horrible massacre. Also, one of the things that listeners have to know, there was a mayor in Omaha. He was more liberal. He tried to intervene. He tried to save Will Brown's life. They nearly tore the white mayor apart for trying to defend Will Brown. So that's a kind of racial hostility and frenzy that consumes Red Summer, and again leads up to Tulsa, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So these are chapters in our history that we need to know. We need to understand that this happened. As I say in the film, it's not a movie. It's not a chapter in a book. It's not fiction. It really happened to our people. It happened to our people. Hundreds of Black people were killed in these massacres, and that helps us understand the context in which we're living today.
And when you reckon with that history and you're looking back at the records, I'm wondering, there's on the one hand these postcards that capture some of these horrible moments. And then there's also the role of the Black press and Ida B. Wells in documenting these things in real time. How important were those sources in creating the documentary, Dawn?
Those were incredibly important, and they're important for a number of reasons. We are living in a time today when facts that are unarguably true are disputed. And so it was very important to me that whatever we described in this film was supported by reporting. That's one of the reasons why it was such a joy and a pleasure to work with DeNeen and some of the other experts that we interviewed. It also, as a filmmaker, it was just a delightful kismet to have DeNeen, our Black female reporter, following in the footsteps of Ida Wells and uncovering before our eyes this current day truth. You know, the Black press behaved marvelously. It just fills me with pride to think of what Ida Wells and the papers across the country did to document the atrocities. And that documentation was there for the asking. You know, many people have remarked to me, and I have the same experience myself of not learning about Red Summer, not learning about the Tulsa Massacre in school. And you know, you have to ask the question why. The sin of omission is as great as the sin of commission, in my opinion. And so part of what DeNeen's reporting has done for us and what we document in the film is meant to begin to address those sins of omission.
One of the really fascinating pieces of information that you unearthed, DeNeen, is the story of Dick Rowland in Tulsa. And he is the victim of misinformation in the spark that sets off the massacre, but also you sort of dove into his backstory and discovered some interesting possibilities. Can you talk a little bit about who he is and the role he played in the Tulsa Massacre and what you learned about him?
Yes. Oh, wow. I love the story of Dick Rowland. This was another story assigned by my editor, Linda Robinson, who said, well, tell us about Dick Rowland. We don't know much about him. So Dick Rowland was a teenager. He was a Black teenager working as a shoe shiner in downtown Tulsa. It was segregated at the time. He was making so much money polishing the shoes of oilmen that he had a diamond in his belt buckle. So that's where he got this nickname, Diamond Dick Rowland. He called himself Diamond Dick Rowland. Well, he's working as a shoe shiner on May 30th, 1921 in downtown Tulsa, where he goes to use the bathroom in a building called the Drexel Building. It's the only building, because of racial segregation, that Black people working in downtown Tulsa were allowed to use the restroom. So he goes into the building. He steps on an elevator that's operated by Sarah Page. She's a young white woman. She's actually a 17-year-old white teenager. And when whatever happened in the elevator, when the doors opened, Sarah shrieks. And Dick Rowland runs, and a department store clerk calls the police. And Dick Rowland is later arrested and taken to the courthouse, where mobs demand that he be released again for lynching. And then Black World War I veterans march to the courthouse and say, no, there will not be a lynching today. You know, they had gone to Europe to fight for democracy. They knew how to fight, and they were not having another lynching of a Black young man in Tulsa. So on May 30th, 1921, the Tulsa Tribune runs a headline that says, "Nab Negro for attack on white girl in elevator." And that's a whistle call to the white Klan members in Tulsa to come to the courthouse and other white members of the white mob. Now, Dick Rowland, what I did in the story that ran just a couple of weeks ago is I went back in the past to find out who Dick Rowland was. So again, he's a teenager. He had been adopted by a Black family in Greenwood, and a lot of his family members, who are still living today, say that Dick Rowland and Sarah Page were actually in love. Like, they were starstruck teenagers. And it may have been the case that after this massacre, they escaped. Dick Rowland is taken out of Tulsa. He survives the massacre. And later on, the family member said that Dick Rowland and Sarah Page got married and lived in Kansas City or somewhere. And he may have changed his name, and certainly she changed her name. But this is what's great about the story. It all started with this love between these two teenagers on this. We don't know what happened on the elevator, but it could have been a love story. So that's what I found out.
I hope that's true. I hope that's true. As we now, learn that soon, Juneteenth will be a federal holiday, and so much attention has been turned towards what happened in Tulsa. I'm hoping that each of you could just give me a sense of whether you feel that we are reckoning with that history in substantial ways, and what you hope that people will take away from the documentary. And I'll throw it to you first, Dawn.
I do feel that we are beginning to reckon with this history. Once the questions are asked, there's kind of no turning away from it. And I have been very heartened by the response to this film and to so many others. This is too large of a story to be encapsulated in any one project. And so, it's my hope that with the many, fantastic films that are out talking about Tulsa, and our film that talks about Tulsa and also the context of the Red Summer, I am feeling that there's not turning back from these truths. And so I do find that very heartening. The question is how far this knowledge will go. So many people have mentioned that they did not learn about these facts in school. There's still a very large question of reparations. When you see, which we show in the film, the itemized list of property lost by the citizens of Greenwood, and then understand that more than 6,000 people were interned in a camp in Tulsa, some for up to 8 days, you start to ask the question of why exactly governments can't begin to compensate people, at least for their economic loss, with interest and penalties. So I think the conversation has begun, and we'll see about the reckoning.
DeNeen, we have about a minute. So I'm going to ask you if you can just sort of give people a sense of what you hope they will take away from the documentary.
Okay, so I'm hoping that people watch the documentary and begin to explore what racism means, what the racist history in this country is, and as I say often, is seek an understanding of racism and oppression and racist history as though you were seeking water in a hot desert, as though your life really depends on it. So so learn as much as you can about racism, learn as much as you can about racial oppression, become what they call the anti-racist, which means actively engaged in the fight against racism. That's what you see in this documentary. You see descendants of these massacre victims crying for justice, crying out for equality, crying out for reparations, and hoping that their stories be heard and that people will listen to them and engage in this fight for justice.
And I'm afraid we will have to leave it there. Thank you both so much, and thank you both for the wonderful documentary. And thank you for joining us at Washington Post Live. And I hope that you will come back tomorrow at noon and join my colleague Jonathan Capehart for another installment of our Race in America, History Matters, series, he'll be speaking with historian Annette Gordon-Reed about her new book on Juneteenth as we quickly approach that day. Thank you again for joining me, and I'm Robin Givhan for the Washington Post.